Hello and welcome back to the channel The Art of Software. In our last video, we discussed about engineering processes, the missing piece of Scrum framework. In this video, we'll dive deeper, exploring how to embed these crucial processes into the Scrum framework. Together, we'll walk through practical steps, real-world implementation to enhance our management framework, to ensure our projects on one hand follow agile principles and on the other hand are robust and efficient. Let's take it together from theory to practice, embedding engineering processes into the Scrum framework. We're going to follow a top-down approach. First of all, we'll discuss about the Scrum ceremonies, about the target of each ceremony, and then we'll dive deeper into the Scrum execution phase. And an important note, in this video we'll still remain in some abstract level. In the next video we will dive deeper into each step separately as part of the sprint execution. And just for the clarification, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We will follow a concrete example. Here are a few things that we should know about the environment. First of all, we use Jira as our main ticketing management system. This is our point of truth. We operate on a 2-week sprint iteration cycle. About the tests, most of our tests are handled as end-to-end tests, and the deployments can be isolated for each feature separately. Now, if your environment is managed differently, I do encourage you to take this example as a template and to adjust it accordingly.
Okay, so I'm using Figma to present the full development lifecycle, and let's start from Scrum ceremony. So I'll zoom in here. Okay, and first of all, the participants. So about the product owner, this is the first one. The target of the product owner is to define what we're going to build and in which order. What is the prioritization? Okay. The next one are the developers. The developers defined as a cross-functional team. It means that they can be the testers, the designers, the programmers, the business analysts, etc. So it is defined as the delivery team. And the last one is the Scrum Master. The Scrum Master manages the process and tries to optimize it. Alright, so these are the main participants in Scrum. Now about the ceremony. So as you can see here, the backlog refinement is outside of the sprint iteration. Okay, it's outside of the sprint cycle. Because backlog refinement is not an official Scrum event, but rather an ongoing activity. But in my opinion, very recommended. So let's start from defining what is the target of the backlog refinement. So the backlog refinement is the process of reviewing, ranking and editing your product backlog. Alright? Practically the target is to make sure that the product backlog is ready for the next sprint. And we can define it by focus on setting tasks by definition of ready, the DOR. It means that each task has to be prioritized with the acceptance criteria that are clearly defined, with at least high-level estimation, because we have to make sure that the tasks are small enough. They can be implemented in a short time duration. If we'll follow the definition of ready, so we could make sure that the product backlog is ready for the next sprint. And as I said, we use Jira, and as you can see, we have here our user stories with, well, hopefully almost all of them, with estimation and prioritization. Now, after the product backlog is ready, we can move to the sprint planning. The purpose of the sprint planning is to define what we can deliver in the sprint and how the work will be achieved. I like to define it in 3 questions. What we are going to build, how we are going to build it, and who is going to be in charge. Now, as you can understand, the sprint planning and the backlog refinement totally rely on each other. In the sprint planning, the development team pulls work from the backlog and commits to deliver that work in the upcoming sprint. In the sprint planning, we have to clarify the requirements and tech implementation to define the main assignee of the task. This is the who, right? Who is going to be in charge. We need to break the task into subtasks. First of all, to raise the dependencies and the relevant participants and to set accurate estimation. Now, I do recommend in this case actually to work in the opposite direction, bottom-up approach. We can take a complex mission to separate it to subtasks, to set the estimation to each subtask, and then to calculate the final estimation for the whole mission. In this case, we will receive a more precise estimation. Hopefully, we will also identify the potential risks and challenges. This is the risks management step. And the final step is to set the completeness criteria, DOD. It is defined as the definition of done. And when we'll discuss about the engineering processes, we'll talk about the definition of done. This is one of the main topics. So in few minutes it will be clear what is the meaning of it. Okay, the output of the sprint planning is that we have the sprint backlog for the upcoming sprint. As you can see here, these are the committed missions for the next sprint with an estimation and also with the assignees. And then the sprint starts, the not defined sprint execution phase. As part of it, this is an actual ceremony, is the daily stand-up, the design, the development, the testing and the deployment. This is the main target of this video. In a moment we'll dive deeper into it. After the sprint execution, we can see the sprint results. We can monitor over the results by two main charts, the velocity and the burndown chart. We can talk about it later, but in this specific example we can see the velocity, the pace of the sprint, what we have committed and what we actually completed, between theory and reality. When we have the sprint results, we can start the retrospective meeting. Actually, in this case, I combine both of them, the sprint retrospective and the sprint review, to one meeting that might long 1 or 2 hours. And the target of this meeting is to gather feedback and ensure transparency in the next steps of the development process. So we start by reviewing the sprint. We go over the results, what we have achieved, and in this part of the meeting also the stakeholders might join us. Then we raise the last retrospective summary and we start a new retrospective meeting. So first of all, the report's overview, as I told you before, the burnout chart and the velocity chart. Then we use some retrospective template. It can be actually created from sprint report in Jira when we complete a sprint. And we want to talk about what went well, what we want to keep doing. Second thing is areas for improvement. As the conclusions, what we need to start do and what we have to stop doing. And the last thing is action items for the next time. The last point here is to adjust the pace for the next sprint. So as I showed you here, as part of the sprint result, we have the velocity chart, and hopefully if we will learn from the sprints, the error rate between the reality and the theory will get smaller. And the output of the retro and review meeting is the retrospective result. Okay, so we just fill, and this is actually auto-generated by Jira in Confluence. Okay, as a retrospective template. And this is one iteration. Great, so we discussed about the ceremonies, and the main one that takes the longest duration is not defined in Scrum. And this is the sprint execution, the 2 weeks duration. This is the target of this video, and now I want to show you an example of how we can manage the sprint execution, how we can define the design, the development, the testing and the deployment steps. Okay, finally, so let's discuss about the actual thing that we came for. Embedding engineering processes inside of the sprint execution phase. So the first thing that I want to show you is this definition of agile iteration. In each iteration, we do the requirements, the design, the development, the testing, deployment and review. What is handled here by Scrum? As I can see it, only the requirements, right, as part of the backlog refinement and maybe the sprint planning, and the review handled by the review and retrospective meetings. What about the other steps? What about the design, the development, the testing and deployment? So we are going to open them, to fully define them as 4 main steps. First of all, the design and test definition in this case, the development, then we have the testing step and the deployment. We'll go over an example that presents a complex solution. One user story that includes technical implementation of few technologies, meaning a realistic situation that more than one person will manage this mission. In our case, it's an MFA mission, and let's just go over the tasks. So it's a 2-factor authentication user login. This is pretty basic mission. As you can see, we have the description. Actually, this is not a fully defined following the acceptance criteria mission, but let's stick with it. So there is a definition, and after the sprint planning, the team already separated it to multiple SAP tasks. So as we can see here, we have a backend implementation and a front-end implementation, okay? More than one developer managed the mission. As we can see in this case, Jack account is the main assignee of the user story, okay? So Jack account practically is going to manage the mission. But Jack is not alone. He is not the only developer. So as you can see here, in this case, also Stefan is part of the user story, and Stefan develops the front-end side. As we can see, the user story also has the story points, the estimation, the priority, and the definition of done, the DOD. Test review, high-level design review, product owner user acceptance test, test execution, pre-deployment steps, and post-deployment steps. We are going to discuss about each step in the definition of done. Now let's also take the subtasks. So as we can see, also the subtasks are well defined. The front-end implementation, it's going to be managed by Stefan. And in this case, the definition of done are different. Here we want to finish the low-level design review, the functional test, and code review. We will discuss about it. Same for the backend implementation mission. So Jack is responsible for the whole user story, and inside of the user story on the backend subtask, and Stefan responsible for the front-end side. And by the way, same DOD here. Alright, let's zoom out. So as we said, the sprint execution starts after the sprint planning. We have the sprint backlog, and we will follow together the steps with this two-factor authentication user login mission. So in this case, these are our developers, and the developers sort of like fetch the mission from the sprint backlog. And in this case, we have two developers, right? Jack and Stefan. And the first main component here is the design and test definition, right? As we had here, the design step. And the main purpose of design and test definition is to plan the implementation, not directly jump into code. Before I'll even start to go over the flow here, is it mandatory? No, it's not mandatory. This is why we have the definition of done. If you would tell me, hey, I have just a small mission or a small bug fix, do I need to now do the test definition, the design? Do I have to plan the implementation? No, it's not mandatory. This is why we have the definition of done. This is why in the sprint planning, the developers take the missions and together they define what is the definition of done. Do they have to pass the test? Do they have to pass the design? Okay, by the complexity, by the risk of the mission, we need to define the definition of done. In this example, I want to show you all of the use cases of definition of done. So let's say that yes, after the sprint planning, we have concluded that we need to pass the design and test definition. I do recommend actually to start from the tests. And as I told you before, it would be still some abstract level. So in the next video, I will explain to you how to define the tests and the different types of tests. But as a prerequisite, we have two types of tests: functional tests and non-functional tests. The functional tests confirm that the code is doing the right things, while non-functional tests validate that the code is doing things the right way. And there is a huge difference. We will discuss about it in the next video. Now, if we will start with the test and do the test review, from my experience, this is the right time to raise questions about the requirements, and this is why the product owner is also mandatory in this meeting. And in the next video, I will share with you also a template to define the test review. Okay, in parallel, the developers will start the design step. And this is actually a tricky part. It's not easy to make an effective design while following the agile principles. Please stick with me to the next video and I'll explain more about it. The target of the design step is planning and communication. So first of all, we want to plan before jumping to code, as I told you before. And the second thing is to communicate effectively the design ideas in the design review. Now, the design review is separated to two steps. The first one is the high-level design review and the low-level design review. And sorry in advance, it's a huge topic. We will dive deep into design in the next videos. Now, if the developers pass the test and the design, so they can continue to the next component, the development. Now, let's make sure that the tickets represent the status. And as you can see here, on the main user story, we finished the test review and high-level design review. And as an important note, the responsibility here is on Jack. Right? Jack is the main assignee for this user story, and Jack handles the test review and the high-level design review. And same goes for the subtask. So as you can see here, Jack is responsible for the backend implementation, and Jack is responsible for the low-level design review. Same as Stefan is responsible for the low-level design review of the front-end side. Okay, so this is just to emphasize the responsibility of the developers, and as you can see, we are fully driven here by Jira. Okay, now we can continue to the next component, the development component. And as you can see also here, we have multiple development components. In this task, we have two developers who can develop simultaneously the backend and the frontend, right? Only if we fully define the contract between these participants. This is one of the main targets of the design review, to accept the contract. Alright, so each task will be handled simultaneously, and in each one of them we will develop as detailed in the issue. Of course, the developer handles this mission. Then the developer performs functional tests, the tests that we define in the test review, right? So this is the functional test part. If we pass the functional test part, we can continue to the code review. And now I didn't actually mention it before, but as you can see in the tasks, we also have here in Jira, we have a reviewers column. So we also must define the reviewers in the sprint planning. Now there are pros and cons if we want to define it as a column in Jira or as a subtask with estimation. We can discuss about it later. Anyway, the reviewers have to be defined in sprint planning and be part of the developers to join also the reviews here. Alright, let's go back here. Okay, so if we pass the code review, so we can continue to the next phase, the testing step. But here we have to stop and to make sure that the full feature is ready, not only the backend side, and of course that they used mocks and the final contract that has been defined to make sure that the feature is ready on their side. But on the testing environment, we want to be fully ready before we are going to perform all of the included tests. And again, pros and cons, we can perform all of the tests before moving on. But the target is to make only the specific tests required, the minimal tests in each environment. So in this case, we selected that we are going to make all of the tests only after we have a full draft of this feature. Okay, in the testing environment, so we are going to deploy the feature to the testing environment, not working locally. So this is very specific for this example, it depends on how you work in your environment. But after it is deployed in the testing environment, we can perform all of the manual tests, including the non-functional tests. We can perform the user acceptance test, and the one who is in charge on user acceptance test execution, in our case, is the product owner, or ideally the stakeholders, and the target here is to validate the feature. Okay, validation versus verification. The developer is responsible for the verification of the feature, that we follow the requirements that have been defined in the task, and after we finish the feature, the product owner, or hopefully again the stakeholders, can validate that this is what they actually wanted, right? And the last one is automation testing. Now again, this is very specific for our current environment. You can also drag this automation testing step from here and to make it as part of the development component. If you want to perform any unit test before you deploy to testing environment, etc. Now how the tasks look like after the testing phase. So we can see here that in the user story, we also finished with the product owner user acceptance test and the test execution. We're almost there, guys. We almost finished the feature. The last part here is the deployment. In this case, this is not something that is mandatory. Only if needed, execute pre-deployment steps. For example, if we raise the risk that there might be some data corruption, it might be the right time to make a DB snapshot before we deploy the feature. After we finish the pre-deployment steps, we can trigger the deployment. Now the feature is in production environment. If needed, we have also to execute post-deployment steps. For example, we added a new feature and now we want to notice to all of our customers to send them an email that now we have a multi-factor authentication. So maybe even this email operation can be a post-deployment step. After we finish the post-deployment step, we will execute smoke and sanity test. This is a subgroup of functional tests and we will discuss about these types in the next video. Finally, the feature is complete. I know this explanation took a bit longer, but trust me, it's worth every minute. Embedding engineering processes into our Scrum routine has been a game changer. In the next videos, we'll discuss about design and tests, how we can achieve these things while following agile principles. I really appreciate you sticking with me, and I hope these insights will help you enhance your own Scrum practices. See you next time.